Abraham Lincoln's story begins in humble surroundings and rises to the heights of leadership that shaped a nation. Born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, Lincoln was the second child of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. His early years were marked by hardship, poverty, and the relentless pursuit of learning despite scant resources. The frontier life was tough. He experienced manual labor from a young age, working on his family's farm, splitting rails for fences, and doing chores that built his physical and mental resilience. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, a tragedy that deeply affected him and left him mostly self-educated. Reading was both his escape and beacon. Through borrowed books and night study by the fireplace, Lincoln cultivated a lifelong love of knowledge, philosophy, and wisdom. Education for Lincoln was irregular and brief. Yet he amassed a profound command of language and ideas, famously absorbing books on law, literature, and history. His passion for debate and public speaking sprouted during his youth, especially after moving to Illinois, where he lived with his father and stepmother. Lincoln's early jobs, store clerk, rail splitter, surveyor, and postmaster, exposed him to various facets of life and people while feeding his relentless ambition. What set Lincoln apart, even from a young age, was his acute intellect combined with humility and honesty, qualities that earned him early respect and the enduring nickname Honest Abe. The beginnings of his political life were modest. Lincoln began his public service as a member of the Illinois State Legislature, serving for terms from 1834. It was during this time that he honed his legal skills, becoming a self-taught lawyer who won cases through sheer logic, empathy, and determination. The legal profession was the front line for his intellectual battles and a stepping stone to national prominence. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Whig, navigating the turbulent political landscape shaped by questions of territorial expansion and slavery. He opposed the Mexican-American War, believing it was unjust, yet his stance cost him political popularity. Lincoln's views on slavery evolved over time. Initially more moderate, he saw slavery as morally wrong and politically insupportable, but was cautious in outright abolitionist rhetoric, aiming, instead, to halt its expansion into new territories. This careful positioning laid the groundwork for his rising prominence as the nation grappled with its sectional divisions. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed the possibility of slavery spreading westward, galvanized Lincoln's political resurgence. He re-entered politics with passionate opposition to slavery's extension, helping found the Republican Party, which positioned itself against the spread of slavery. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858, particularly the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates for the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois, thrust him onto the national stage. Though he lost the Senate race, he impressed the nation with his eloquence, moral clarity, and vision for the Union. The debates crystallized his position against slavery while affirming the principles of democracy and the rule of law. By 1860, Lincoln was the Republican candidate for president, a role that would define his legacy. His election set off a chain of events that led to the secession of Southern states and eventually the Civil War. Lincoln's presidency began in a deeply divided America. Challenges greeted him on all sides: economic instability, sectarianism, and the imminent threat of civil war. His leadership during the Civil War 1865 demonstrated his extraordinary capacity to navigate complex political and military landscapes. Lincoln's goal was clear: preserve the Union at all costs. His commitment to this cause was matched by his evolving views on slavery, which became more abolitionist as the war progressed. His issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 transformed the conflict into a crusade for human freedom and altered the course of American history. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the United States was hanging by a thread. 7 Southern states had already seceded after his election, forming the Confederate States of America, and more were preparing to leave. The air was thick with fear, uncertainty, and the possibility of violent conflict on an unprecedented scale. Lincoln, a relatively unknown figure to many Americans outside the Midwest, found himself at the helm of a fractured nation. Already, people questioned whether this tall, self-taught lawyer with his folksy humor could preserve the Union. Yet Lincoln understood something essential: leadership in moments of crisis required calm persistence, moral clarity, and a willingness to endure the scorn of critics to serve a higher cause. From the start, Lincoln's letters, speeches, and cabinet meetings revealed his balancing act. He needed to reassure the border states, slave-holding states that had not yet seceded, that he would not immediately abolish slavery in areas where it was already established, while simultaneously convincing the North that he was strong enough to resist the Confederacy's challenge. Any misstep might push more states into rebellion or weaken Northern morale. His inaugural address struck this delicate balance, firmly asserting that the Union was perpetual and that secession was illegal, but offering no direct threat to slavery itself. Yet, in the South, his words were read as defiance. The die was cast. Barely a month after he assumed office, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In response, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This action galvanized both sides. It rallied the North but pushed Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee into secession. With that, the Civil War began in full force. Few imagined it would last for long years and claim more than 600,000 lives. Lincoln was not a military man by training, but he quickly immersed himself in the study of strategy and military logistics. Early in the war, he faced a frustrating string of inaction and setbacks from Union generals, particularly George B. McClellan, whose excessive caution often paralyzed the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln, while respectful of expertise, grew impatient with delay. He famously remarked to one visitor that if General McClellan did not intend to use the army, he would like to borrow it for a while. This mixture of wit and sharp criticism was characteristic of Lincoln. Humor as a pressure valve, cutting truth as a motivator. While he wrestled with battlefield challenges, Lincoln also navigated political landmines. The war was not only fought with muskets and cannons, but with speeches, legislation, and editorials. His government needed to raise funds, manage supplies, and maintain public support among disparate factions. Radical Republicans pushing for immediate emancipation, conservative Unionists fearing social upheaval, and Northern Democrats critical of wartime measures. Every decision could alienate one side even as it strengthened another. One of the most remarkable aspects of Lincoln's leadership during this time was his cabinet, dubbed the team of rivals by later historians. Many of his key advisers, including Secretary of State William H. Seward, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, had once been political opponents. Lincoln deliberately brought them into his administration, believing it better to have their talents and influence working for him rather than against him. This was an extraordinary political gamble, one that required immense patience, humility, and the ability to guide strong-willed men toward common goals despite their clashes. The question of slavery loomed over every political and military decision. Initially, Lincoln's Central War aim was the preservation of the Union, not the outright abolition of slavery. But as the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear that slavery was at the heart of the conflict. Without undermining the economic and social systems that supported the Confederacy, a lasting peace would be impossible. Enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines in growing numbers, forcing the government to decide their fate. Generals in the field issued their own emancipation orders, prompting inconsistent policies. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln's thinking had shifted. He concluded that freeing enslaved people in rebel-held territories was both a moral imperative and a military necessity. Depriving the Confederacy of labor while adding to Union manpower through the enlistment of black soldiers. After the Union's hard-fought victory at Antietam in September 1862, a battle that cost over 22,000 casualties in a single day, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be forever free. This was a bold, transformative act. It reframed the war as a fight for human liberty as well as for national unity, ensuring that Britain and France, whose economies had deep connections to Southern cotton, would find it politically impossible to recognize or aid the Confederacy. But the proclamation also drew fierce backlash in parts of the North, where racial prejudice and fears of emancipation's consequences ran deep. Lincoln accepted the political risks, believing history would vindicate him. The issuance of the proclamation marked a turning point in Lincoln's legacy. He took an active role in promoting the enlistment of African American troops, who would go on to serve with distinction in regiments like the 54th Massachusetts. Lincoln personally visited hospitals, met with soldiers, and corresponded with bereaved families. His empathy was genuine and widely recognized. Soldiers referred to him as Father Abraham. Yet, political and personal trials did not relent. On the home front, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in certain areas to maintain order, a decision criticized by civil libertarians as authoritarian. Draft riots erupted in New York City in 1863, fueled by resentment toward the military draft and racial tensions. Newspapers lambasted him for overstepping his constitutional authority and political opponents plotted to block his re-election in 1864. On the battlefield, Union armies pursued a war of attrition under General Ulysses S. Grant, whom Lincoln elevated to overall command in 1860 for after recognizing his relentless determination. Grant's strategy, grinding down Confederate forces through constant engagement, was costly in lives but ultimately effective. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia further broke the South's capacity to sustain the war. Lincoln's 1860 for re-election campaign was one of the most pivotal in American history. Many believed he would lose to Democratic candidate George B. McClellan, who advocated a negotiated peace that might have left the Union permanently divided. But Union victories late that year, especially Sherman's capture of Atlanta, buoyed Northern morale. Lincoln won decisively, interpreting his mandate as a call to push for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery outright. The result was the 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in January 1865, which permanently outlawed slavery in the United States. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln spoke with a blend of grief, humility, and prophetic vision. He famously reflected that the war was divine punishment for the national sin of slavery and urged reconciliation with malice toward none, with charity for all. His words hinted at his plans for a lenient Reconstruction, one that would heal divisions without humiliating the South. Tragically, he would not live to see that vision carried out. By April 1865, the end of the war was in sight. On April 9th, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the conflict. Lincoln was finally able to walk through the streets of Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, where newly freed African Americans hailed him as a liberator. Witnesses recalled the awe and joy of that day. It was the culmination of years of heartbreak, sacrifice, and unwavering leadership. Yet, just 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. There, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning, on April 15th, at the age of 56. The nation plunged into collective mourning. His funeral procession traveled from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, where he was laid to rest. For millions, the grief was personal. They had lost not just a president, but a symbol of hope, unity, and moral courage. Lincoln's wartime leadership had demanded incredible mental stamina and moral resilience. He had faced political hostility, military failure, personal tragedy, including the death of his beloved son Willie in 1862 and the crushing burden of command during the nation's bloodiest conflict. Yet he endured, guided by a vision of a more perfect union and an unshakable belief in the principle that all human beings deserved liberty. This part of Lincoln's life is a testament to how a leader can navigate unprecedented crises with both firmness and humanity. He was not flawless. His decisions were controversial. His powers stretched to their limits, his struggles with depression well documented. Yet it was precisely his humanity, coupled with his unwavering purpose, that made him legendary. While Abraham Lincoln is often remembered in monumental terms, the savior of the Union, the great emancipator, a martyred president. In private life, he was a man full of paradoxes, subtle complexities, and deeply human qualities. These aspects, though less celebrated in textbooks, hold perhaps the greatest power to inspire modern audiences, for they show a leader who was not born extraordinary, but who shaped himself, step by step, through discipline, learning, and moral courage. Physically, Lincoln was striking in an unconventional way. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, towering over most men of his era, he had impossibly long limbs. A slim build, coarse dark hair, and large, rugged hands from years of manual labor. His face bore the lines of hardship and thoughtfulness, with deep-set eyes that could seem melancholy one moment and sparkle with mischief the next. Some contemporaries initially found his appearance awkward or even homely, but after hearing him speak, many testified that his expressions could transform, his gaze compelling, his gestures animated by intelligence and sincerity. He radiated authenticity, and that was far more important than polished looks. One of Lincoln's most defining traits was his humor, which was as much a survival tool as a social gift. He loved telling stories, often drawn from frontier life, which could be long-winded, but always had a point or a sharp punchline. His ability to disarm tension with a joke became legendary. In political debates, he might answer a heated insult with self-deprecating humor, undercutting hostility without surrendering his position. This habit was not a mere tactic. It reflected a worldview. Lincoln understood that humor could bridge differences, soothe pain, and give people the courage to keep going. Friends remembered that he used to say, "If I did not laugh, I should die." Especially during the harrowing days of the Civil War, when the weight of the nation seemed unbearable. But Lincoln's humor existed alongside an intense inner life often shadowed by melancholy. What we would today call clinical depression. Historical accounts describe periods when he seemed enveloped by sadness, sitting silent for hours, staring into the distance. In his youth, he wrote poetry touched with themes of death and impermanence. His law partner William Herndon and others believed these dark moods were part of Lincoln's nature, perhaps inherited from his mother's side. He confronted them not by succumbing, but by channeling his emotional depth into empathy for others and into principled action. His struggles remind us that leadership and mental health challenges are not incompatible. In fact, Lincoln's ability to endure personal anguish may have deepened his capacity for compassion and moral clarity. His marriage to Mary Todd Lincoln was itself a study in contrasts. Mary was from a wealthy Kentucky family, well-educated, politically astute, and fiercely ambitious for her husband. She also had a temper, sharp opinions, and suffered from what many historians now believe was bipolar disorder. Their relationship saw affection, quarrels, loyalty, and strain. Mary adored and advocated for Lincoln, yet their domestic life was not idyllic. They suffered the loss of 3 of their 4 children to illness, Eddie in 1850, Willie in 1862, and Tad in 1871, after Lincoln's own death. The death of Willie, their bright and beloved 11-year-old, during Lincoln's presidency, nearly broke both parents. Even in the midst of military crises, Lincoln would slip away to the White House stables to be near Willie's pony, seeking a bittersweet comfort. Lincoln's relationship with his children reflected the gentler side of his nature. He was remarkably indulgent for a Victorian-era father. Young Tad and Willie would often burst into cabinet meetings, playing or climbing onto their father's lap, even as generals and secretaries discussed matters of state. Lincoln welcomed this interruption, perhaps because the innocence of his sons was a needed antidote to the grim realities he faced daily. His tolerance for children's noise and spontaneity contrasted with the strict decorum expected of leaders at the time, endearing him to those who witnessed these moments. Beyond his personal life, there are numerous lesser-known episodes that reveal Lincoln's moral courage before he ever became president. Early in his legal career, for instance, he encountered cases that tested his sense of justice. In one, he famously halted mid-trial when he realized that the client he was defending was indeed guilty, returning the retainer fee and refusing to proceed. In another, he walked several miles in the rain to return 6.5 cents to a customer he had accidentally overcharged in his storekeeping days, earning him the nickname Honest Abe. These stories, while sometimes romanticized, are corroborated enough to reflect a genuine pattern. Lincoln's reputation for integrity was hard-earned and deeply ingrained. One fascinating facet of Lincoln's intellectual life was how thoroughly self-directed it was. He had less than a year of formal schooling in total, and yet he mastered complex legal reasoning, rhetoric, and political theory through solitary study. His reading included the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's fables, the works of Robert Burns, classical history, and law books borrowed from judges. He practiced oratory by reciting passages aloud and debating with friends over campfires. This autodidactic path imbued him with a style of reasoning that was both analytical and plain-spoken, able to connect lofty ideals with the concerns of ordinary citizens. It also meant that Lincoln valued learning as a lifelong endeavor, an attitude that modern audiences can find deeply motivating. Lincoln's moral evolution on the subject of slavery is another area where his humanity and thoughtfulness shine through. He was not born an abolitionist. Like many Americans of his time, his earlier views were shaped by the norms and prejudices of the society around him. What set Lincoln apart was his willingness to grow. Over decades, through debate, observation, and personal encounter, he moved from opposing the expansion of slavery to advocating for its total abolition. Private letters show him wrestling with the contradictions between America's founding ideals and the existence of human bondage. This intellectual and moral journey was not instantaneous. It was the product of reflection, empathy, and courage to change one's mind when confronted with truth. The Civil War years also brought out acts of personal kindness by Lincoln that official histories often overlook. He regularly visited hospitals to sit with wounded soldiers, not as a photo opportunity, but in genuine solidarity. Nurses reported that he would read to injured men, hold their hands, or write to their families. He pardoned soldiers accused of desertion when he believed the young men acted out of desperation rather than malice. Decisions, sometimes criticized by his generals but rooted in Lincoln's desire to temper justice with mercy. Another, lesser-known aspect of Lincoln's legacy is his openness to dissenting voices. In cabinet meetings, he listened attentively even to ideas he opposed, sometimes allowing criticism to stand unchallenged if it served to clarify the stakes. He was known to change course if someone presented compelling evidence. This humility, the ability to admit error or adjust strategy, separated Lincoln from leaders who cling to pride at the expense of results. While he could be stubborn on core principles, he was pragmatic in execution, often experimenting with policy until it worked. Curiously, Lincoln also had a lifelong fascination with technology and innovation. He is still the only U.S. president to have received a patent for a device to lift boats over shoals and obstructions in rivers. Though it was never manufactured, this invention reveals his tinkerer's spirit and willingness to think outside conventional political skills. During the war, he avidly supported the development of new military technologies, from ironclad warships to advanced artillery, seeing in them a way to shorten the conflict. Lincoln's spirituality was just as complex. While not an orthodox churchgoer in his early life, his speeches show a deepening sense of divine providence as the burdens of the presidency intensified. He often spoke of God's will in ways that avoided sectarianism, suggesting that both North and South might be judged for the nation's sins. This nuanced religious perspective allowed him to speak across divides, uniting audiences with moral reflection rather than fueling sectarian rivalry. By the end of his life, Lincoln had become not just a political figure, but a moral symbol, yet he never lost his grounding in ordinary human experience. Witnesses recall that on the day of his second inauguration, he paused in the rain to shake hands with ordinary citizens for hours, smiling warmly despite his fatigue. That mix of humility, perseverance, and relatable humanity ensured that his death struck the nation like a personal bereavement. This shows that a man who was not a marble statue but a living, breathing soul, capable of laughter in the darkest times, vulnerable to grief, open to change, and steadfast in his moral compass. These qualities, as much as his grand political achievements, explain why Lincoln continues to inspire across cultures and centuries. On the night of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Washington, D.C. was alive with celebration. The slaughter of the Civil War was finally ending, and the promise of peace, however uncertain, was in the air. Lincoln, weary but relieved, decided to attend a play at Ford's Theatre with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and their guests. The play was a light-hearted British comedy, Our American Cousin. For a man who had carried the nation's agony on his shoulders for long years, an evening of diversion seemed well-earned. But as the final act approached, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and ardent Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the presidential box, leveled a .44 caliber Derringer pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The sound was more like a pop than a boom, easily drowned out by laughter from the audience at a comedic line. For a brief moment, many in the theater were confused. Booth leapt dramatically from the box to the stage, breaking his leg as he landed, and shouted something. Remembered by most as Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia before escaping into the night. Lincoln was carried, unconscious and bleeding, across 10th Street to the Peterson boarding house. The cramped back bedroom where he lay soon filled with cabinet members, doctors, generals, and close friends. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln was inconsolable, often weeping, and collapsing in sobs. Through the night, surgeons did what little they could. Lincoln never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, he took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, his eyes full of tears, is said to have murmured, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news spread like wildfire. It was hard for Americans, even those who had opposed him politically, to grasp that the tall, tireless man who had guided them through the Civil War was gone. In the North, grief was visceral. Whole cities draped buildings in black crepe. Churches held impromptu memorial services. Businesses closed. Flags flew at half-mast. Across the country, sermons, poems, and eulogies poured forth. Even in the South, where Lincoln had been vilified, there were quiet expressions of regret from those who recognized the humanity that underpinned his policies of reconciliation. Lincoln's funeral became one of the most elaborate and emotional in American history. His body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, then in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands of mourners filed past in silence. From there, his coffin began a 1,654-mile journey back to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse the route he had taken as president-elect in February 1861. At every stop, crowds gathered in grief, some weeping openly, some bringing flowers, others simply standing in reverent silence. In New York City, more than 100,000 people viewed the procession. In Albany, schoolchildren sang hymns as the casket passed. In Buffalo, elderly veterans saluted. The train was draped in mourning cloth, and inside, alongside Lincoln's coffin, lay the coffin of his son Willie to be buried near his father. The nation's mourning was not only for the man, but for an unrealized vision. Lincoln's idea for Reconstruction, with malice toward none, with charity for all, suggested a lenient reintegration of the Southern states, avoiding punitive measures that might deepen division. His death left a vacuum of leadership at precisely the moment when unity was most fragile. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's political finesse and moral authority, leading to bitter conflicts with Congress and a harsher, more turbulent Reconstruction than Lincoln had envisioned. In the months and years following his death, Lincoln began a transformation from a polarizing wartime leader into a near-mythic figure in the national consciousness. Just as George Washington embodied the founding of the nation, Lincoln came to symbolize its preservation and moral awakening. Artists painted him as a stoic, almost saintly figure. Orators invoked his words to inspire civic virtue. Schoolchildren learned not just about his presidency, but about his humble origins, the log cabin, the self-education by firelight, the rail splitting. These elements became canonized parts of the Lincoln legend, emphasizing the American ideal of rising from obscurity to greatness through integrity and hard work. Yet it's worth noting that this posthumous elevation also simplified his image. His political missteps, the depth of his personal struggles, and his gradual moral evolution on slavery were often smoothed over in favor of a narrative that presented him as an almost flawless hero. The real Lincoln, the complex, sometimes conflicted, deeply human leader, risked being overshadowed by the marble-like figure carved into public monuments. Memorialization of Lincoln began almost immediately. In 1867, Congress authorized the building of a national monument in Washington, though it would take decades before the Lincoln Memorial was completed in 1922. In the meantime, towns, counties, and schools across the country began bearing his name. Statues appeared in city squares. His birthday became a celebrated holiday in many states, later merged into President's Day. His speeches, especially the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural, became staples of American civic culture, frequently memorized, quoted, and reprinted. Globally, Lincoln's reputation also grew. In England, many working-class people who had admired his anti-slavery stance saw him as a champion of liberty. In Italy, nationalists fighting for unification viewed him as a symbol of self-determination. Even in places far removed from the American Civil War, Lincoln's story of a common man rising to meet a moral crisis resonated deeply. Interestingly, myths and apocryphal stories multiplied. The image of honest Abe walking miles to return a few pennies was repeated endlessly. Tales of his clairvoyance, including a famous but probably exaggerated account of a dream he had predicting his own assassination, circulated widely in newspapers and lectures. While often embellished, these stories reinforced the idea of Lincoln as both humble and touched by destiny. The assassination itself gave his life a martyr's arc, sealing his legacy in a way few living politicians ever enjoy. That he died at the very moment of triumph over the Confederacy lent his story a Shakespearean quality. It also meant that Americans could project onto him the policies and ideals they hoped for. Untested by the messy realities of post-war governance. For decades after his death, Lincoln's image was invoked by politicians of all stripes. Republicans claimed him as the founder of their party's commitment to union and liberty. Progressives in the early 20th century drew from his speeches to argue for social reform. Civil rights leaders, including Frederick Douglass in his later years and Martin Luther King Jr. a century later, used Lincoln's moral language to press for racial equality. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech was deliberately delivered at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, framing the struggle for civil rights as an extension of Lincoln's unfinished work. The physical commemorations multiplied. Beyond the grand memorial in Washington with Daniel Chester, French's seated statue, and carved inscriptions of Lincoln's most famous speeches, dozens of other monuments arose in the United States and abroad. His boyhood home in Kentucky and his Springfield home in Illinois became historic sites. His face was placed on the $5 bill and the penny. In 1911, the Lincoln Highway, one of the first transcontinental roads in America, was named in his honor. Yet, even in commemoration, debates about Lincoln persisted. Some historians questioned whether posthumous idealization obscured the more radical aspects of his thought, particularly his willingness to push constitutional boundaries in order to secure justice. Others argued that his legacy was sometimes misused to justify policies he would not have supported. But in the public imagination, Lincoln remained, above all, a unifying figure, a reminder that moral leadership and democratic ideals could survive even the gravest national crisis. The moment when Abraham Lincoln the man became Abraham Lincoln the legend, reshaped by grief, memory, and aspiration into a symbol not just of a preserved union, but of a moral struggle that resonates far beyond 19th century America. the popular image of Abraham Lincoln as a born statesman often obscures the truth. His leadership was not a product of destiny alone, but of a conscious, disciplined development of character and skill over decades. By the time he reached the presidency, Lincoln had shaped a set of guiding principles, forged in hardship, political defeats, and deep moral reflection that would carry him through the darkest hours of American history. To understand Lincoln's enduring legacy, one must study not only what he did, but how and why he did it. One of Lincoln's most striking qualities was his extraordinary patience. This was not an idle or passive patience, but a strategic one, the kind that allowed him to absorb criticism, delay impulsive reactions, and wait for the right moment to act. During the Civil War, this patience was repeatedly tested. Political allies urged swifter moves toward emancipation. Generals pushed for more troops. Opponents attacked him as either too radical or too cautious. Lincoln listened carefully to all sides, weighed the evidence, and often chose to let events clarify before committing himself. This ability to hold steady under pressure prevented rash decisions, but also meant that, when he did act, the timing was deliberate and the commitment firm. Equally important was his skill in communication. Lincoln's speeches and writings were deceptively simple, succinct, clear, and loaded with moral resonance. The Gettysburg Address, at just 272 words, distilled the war's meaning into an appeal for a new birth of freedom. His letters were crafted with precision, often blending empathy with logic. Even in private notes, later dubbed the Meditation on the Divine Will, or hot letters he never sent, we see him thinking carefully through his reasoning. He understood that words could be both weapons and bridges, and he wielded them with rare mastery. Lincoln's leadership was marked by his unusual willingness to share power. The team of rivals approach, bringing political opponents into his cabinet, was not mere magnanimity, but a calculated method of harnessing the best talent available while preventing those rivals from undermining him from outside. This demanded self-confidence and a humility rare among leaders. Lincoln did not fear being outshone. In fact, he often gave others credit for successes, reserving blame for himself when things went wrong. This posture not only earned loyalty, but made it easier to maintain unity among fractious factions. His decision-making process was a blend of principle and pragmatism. Core values, the preservation of the Union, the belief in liberty, the commitment to constitutional governance, were non-negotiable. But within those boundaries, Lincoln was remarkably adaptable. For example, his stance on emancipation shifted as he recognized both the moral urgency and the military advantage of ending slavery. He tested policies, revised them when necessary, and was unafraid to reverse course if facts changed. In this way, Lincoln demonstrated what modern strategists call strategic flexibility, clarity of ends, adaptability of means. Critically, Lincoln mastered the art of empathy in leadership. Whether speaking with generals, wounded soldiers, grieving families, or political adversaries, he sought to understand others' perspectives. This was not mere sentiment. It was a tool for building coalitions and diffusing conflict. By acknowledging even his opponent's sincerity, as he did in the second inaugural, when he recognized that both North and South read the same Bible and pray to the same God, he reframed disputes as shared human struggles rather than irreconcilable hostilities. Lincoln also recognized that leadership in a democracy required public legitimacy. He worked tirelessly to maintain the support of the people, using his speeches, public letters, and reputation for honesty to rally opinion. He avoided unnecessary secrecy, believing the public had a right to understand the stakes. Even controversial measures, such as the suspension of habeas corpus, were eventually explained within a constitutional framework. In this sense, Lincoln anticipated modern expectations for transparent governance. His humor, often underestimated, was a key leadership tool. In times of crisis, he used stories and jokes to disarm tension in meetings, to soften the delivery of criticism, and to remind colleagues not to take themselves too seriously in the face of monumental challenges. Laughter, for Lincoln, was medicine against despair, both his own and the nation's. Even during the grimmest days of the war, he refused to abandon this habit. Lincoln's moral courage stood out most starkly in moments of isolation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued against the advice of some who warned it could cost him the 1864 election. Choosing Ulysses S. Grant as his top general risked aligning himself with a commander who had been accused of recklessness and alcoholism. Enduring a long war of attrition meant facing public weariness, draft riots, and political attacks. In each case, Lincoln bore the weight of unpopularity, rather than sacrifice what he believed necessary to preserve the Union and advance justice. From these traits emerge several timeless lessons for leaders in any arena. Anchor in core principles, but remain flexible on strategy. Lincoln's unshakable commitment to union and liberty kept him steady, but his tactics evolved with circumstances. In business, politics, or personal life, this balance between principle and adaptability is critical. Build diverse teams and manage rivalries through inclusion. Bringing opponents into his cabinet allowed Lincoln to harness talent and ensure dissenting voices contributed constructively rather than destructively. Modern organizations likewise benefit from diversity of thought, managed with humility and authority. Communicate with clarity, brevity, and moral force. Lincoln's speeches endure because they speak plainly yet profoundly. Effective leaders distill complex issues into clear messages that resonate with values, not just policies. Exercise patience in decision-making. In an age of instant reactions, Lincoln's willingness to let situations evolve before acting is a reminder that timing can be as important as the decision itself. Lead with empathy. Understanding others' perspectives, even adversaries, is essential to negotiation, coalition building, and conflict resolution. Maintain personal resilience. Lincoln's capacity to find humor and hope amid personal loss and national catastrophe underscores the importance of emotional endurance in leadership. Interestingly, Lincoln's leadership was deeply shaped by his early life experiences in poverty and on the frontier. The independence and self-reliance he learned there translated into a calm confidence during crises. His limited formal education trained him to extract maximum value from limited resources, a mindset he applied in both law and politics. The rail splitter who became president never entirely lost his connection to ordinary Americans, which reinforced the authenticity that defined his public persona. Lincoln also displayed what modern psychologists would call a growth mindset. He believed in the potential for personal improvement in himself and in others. He changed his mind when new evidence emerged, admitted when he was wrong, and sought out challenges that would force him to grow. This intellectual humility allowed him to adapt to the shifting political and military landscapes of the Civil War. In the end, Lincoln's style was not about domination or charisma in the traditional sense. His authority flowed from trust, moral example, and a steady hand in turbulent times. He led less by proclamations of power and more by persuasion, patience, and presence. This understated style, one that valued substance over show, unity over ego, is perhaps why his leadership remains so relevant in an era often defined by division and spectacle. The death of Abraham Lincoln marked not only the end of the first chapter of America's national crisis, but the beginning of a new era defined by struggle over his legacy. What did Lincoln's life and presidency mean in the years and centuries that followed? For a young nation scarred by civil war, his memory became a crucible in which ideals, unity, freedom, equality, were reforged and disputed, adopted by new generations and reinterpreted in startlingly diverse ways. In the first few decades after Lincoln's assassination, the United States faced the immense challenge of Reconstruction. Freed from the immediate threat of Confederate rebellion, the federal government now had to integrate millions of formerly enslaved people into the fabric of society, heal the wounds of war, and resolve lingering questions about federal versus state power. Lincoln himself had not left explicit or detailed blueprints for Reconstruction. His approach, revealed in speeches and letters, combined leniency with a demanding call for justice. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he urged, hoping to reintegrate Southern states without vengeance. But his death meant this vision was left to successors less politically deft. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's immediate successor, lacked the moral authority, empathy, and political skill that Lincoln had wielded. Congressional leaders, particularly the radical Republicans, quickly took the reins, pushing for a more punitive, far-reaching Reconstruction. Constitutional amendments, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th extending suffrage to black men, transformed the legal landscape. Yet, backlash and resistance in the South led to Jim Crow laws, segregation, and a century of racial injustice that haunted the nation. For many African Americans, Lincoln's promise was both a beacon and a bitter memory of hope deferred. Yet Lincoln's words, not just his policies, became fuel for progress. Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist who once met Lincoln in the White House, gave eulogies, insisting that Lincoln was not simply the white man's president, but the leader who had expanded the vision of liberty to embrace the struggles of the oppressed. Douglass, who had sometimes criticized Lincoln's caution, ultimately regarded him as a man of the people, whose growth was itself an example of moral transformation. As the generations passed, Lincoln's legacy became touchstone for movements seeking justice. In the early 20th century, as America urbanized and industrialized, progressive reformers invoked Lincoln's image and rhetoric to frame their calls for political transparency, anti-corruption, and civic morality. His defense of democracy and liberty provided moral cover for fights against trusts, child labor, and political machines. Presidents from both parties sought to claim him: Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy all quoted Lincoln in landmark speeches. Even in moments of high partisan tension, Lincoln was often evoked as the unifying figure above the fray. Perhaps Lincoln's greatest direct impact was on the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Martin Luther King Jr., when addressing 250,000 people at the 1963 March on Washington, chose the steps of the Lincoln Memorial for his "I Have a Dream" speech. King's speech deliberately echoed Lincoln's own words. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation to frame the struggle for racial justice as the fulfillment of Lincoln's vision. The symbolism was pointed. The battle for equality was not finished with the end of slavery, but required perpetual renewal. Lincoln's image and language fueled practical change. The Emancipation Proclamation became a legal precedent and moral touchstone for legal efforts to challenge racial segregation. The notion of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, first voiced at Gettysburg, was used by movements for voting rights, fair labor, and women's suffrage. His words resonated in classrooms, courtrooms, protest rallies, and legislative chambers. Yet, his legacy was not unchallenged or monolithic. The meaning of Lincoln became a site of contest. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some Southern politicians and writers sought to reclaim Lincoln, emphasizing his willingness to forgive the South. Others, especially after the rise of the lost cause narrative, argued that his advocacy for federal supremacy had set dangerous precedent. In the North, the image of Lincoln as infallible grew so strong that critics found it nearly impossible to point out his very real struggles, doubts, and evolution. Globally, Lincoln's legacy crossed oceans and cultures. In Europe, he was seen as a defender of democracy over autocracy. Students protesting tyranny in Hungary and Poland, reformers in India and South Africa, and politicians in post-war Japan all cited Lincoln's story. The self-made man who persisted through hardship stressed unity and equality as a template for their own causes. In Africa and Asia, nations emerging from colonial rule found inspiration in Lincoln's navigation of division and conflict. Mohandas Gandhi, for instance, kept a well-worn copy of Lincoln's biography, marking passages on compromise, individual conscience, and nonviolence. South Africans fighting apartheid invoked Lincoln's emancipation proclamation and his calls for mercy and justice as models for their transition from repression to democracy. Even beyond politics, popular culture adopted Lincoln as a figure of mythic resonance. Theatrical plays, paintings, films, and novels depicted the president striding through splitting rails, signing proclamations, or battling personal demons. He became a symbol of American honesty and perseverance. Cartoons, advertisements, and even brands caricatured his tall frame and stovepipe hat. Sometimes wise, sometimes sentimental, occasionally used for humor. Among the more curious appropriations, Lincoln was recast as a detective, vampire hunter, and action hero in modern fiction. His face appeared on coins, postage stamps, portraits in classrooms and offices. The Lincoln Memorial became not just a tribute, but a kind of secular shrine visited by millions every year, invoked in moments of crisis and hope. As scholarship evolved, so too did the understanding of Lincoln's actual political and moral dilemmas. Historians dug deeper, revealing the complexities of his views on race, constitutional authority, and economic policy. Lincoln was neither the abolitionist radical nor cautious conservative of caricature, but something more intricate, a man whose positions changed as the landscape changed, whose moral courage was matched by his ability to strategize with subtlety and patience. Research into his law cases, private letters, and early parliamentary battles uncovered a much more dynamic thinker, emphatic in some moments, conciliatory in others, but always striving to balance principle and politics. One of the most enduring questions surrounded Lincoln's views on race. While remembered as the great emancipator, Lincoln's public speeches and private comments before and even during the Civil War reflected the prejudices and complicated opinions of his time. Early in his career, Lincoln favored colonization, the idea of resettling freed slaves outside the United States, which today is viewed as deeply problematic. His position evolved, however, especially as black soldiers proved their courage on the battlefield and as abolitionists pressed for equality. By the end of his life, Lincoln was advocating not only for emancipation but for limited black suffrage, an extraordinary stance for the era. Social movements continued to mine Lincoln's words and life for hope. Labor organizers celebrated his spot, resolutions in Congress against the Mexican-American War, echoing his demand for justice in foreign policy. Women's rights campaigners invoked his style of reasoned, empathetic debate. Suffragettes reprinted the Gettysburg Address with women added to of the people, by the people, for the people. LGBTQ activists cited his notion of a more perfect union as a reason for inclusive citizenship. Politically, leaders used Lincoln's image in ways both noble and self-serving. Some invoked his popularity for partisan advantage. Others genuinely cited his example to justify moments of courage or reform. Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama both adopted Lincoln as an emblem. Reagan for bold vision and unity, Obama for bridging divides and seeking progress for all. Obama took the oath of office in 2009 with his hand on Lincoln's Bible, underscoring connection between a new era of change and the unfinished work of justice that Lincoln symbolized. Even moments of national crisis were filtered through Lincoln's legacy. During the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt cited Lincoln as precedent for extraordinary federal measures. In World War II, soldiers and citizens rallied around Lincoln's memory as proof that democracy could survive devastation. After the September 11th attacks, spontaneous memorials at the Lincoln Memorial and other sites saw citizens seek comfort in his words. Schools taught Lincoln's story as a parable, sometimes glossing over complexity, sometimes embracing it, depicting transformation as the heart of citizenship. His tale of self-driven learning became a narrative for American aspiration. His empathy and humor a model for character. But as historical understanding deepened, debate grew. Some pointed to Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and limits on press freedom as troubling precedents. Others studied his cautious approach to emancipation, weighing pragmatic constraints against moral urgency. In literature, poets and playwrights explored Lincoln's anxieties and sorrows, his bouts with depression, doubts about destiny, fear for his family. These renderings made Lincoln more accessible, not less, revealing leadership as a struggle, not a fixed virtue. The story came full circle in recent generations. As new questions of race, justice, democracy, and division arose amid polarization, inequality, and anxiety over the future, Americans and others turned again to Lincoln's legacy, sometimes selectively, sometimes critically. What did his unfinished vision require from us now? Did government of the people, by the people, for the people mean simple majority rule, or the protection of rights for all? Was Lincoln's willingness to change his mind a reminder to revisit our own prejudices? Were his calls for malice toward none, charity for all relevant when anger and bitterness seemed more common in public discourse? His legacy became a question not of answers, but of challenge, a summons to reflection, dialogue, and transformation. Lincoln's image now stands at the intersection of history and aspiration. In statues, paintings, coins, and speeches, he is both revered and revised. A lesson in leadership that is not about perfection or destiny, but about the perpetual struggle toward a more perfect union. In times of crisis, debate, or hope, his life offers not just inspiration, but an invitation to learn, to grow, and to persist. To look for Abraham, Lincoln's legacy is, in a sense, to look for America's living heart. Yet, beneath the marble monuments and the thunderous proclamations, there lives a Lincoln of gentle oddities, private mysteries, and moments so unlikely they can only be true because they are too strange to invent. These are the stories that pull us closer to the real person. Turning the icon back into flesh and blood, the puzzle pieces beyond history's headlines, sometimes tragic, sometimes whimsical, always riveting. At first glance, Lincoln's early life seems an endless series of toil, rails split, fields cleared, little formal education, books hungrily read by firelight. Yet, the deeper one looks, the more peculiar the details become. As a child, Lincoln's world was wild and hazardous. He almost drowned in Knob Creek as a boy and was rescued by a friend, grabbing him by the hair. Once, he was kicked in the head by a horse and lay unconscious for hours, a brush with mortality that some biographers believe made him thoughtful beyond his years. On another occasion, he ran afoul of a neighbor's wild turkey and barely escaped after an awkward chase through thick brush. Such stories, recounted by family and neighbors, suggest the making of a man with an unusual sensitivity to both danger and humor. Lincoln's appetite for learning had a curious edge. In the backwoods of Indiana and Illinois, books were rare treasures. He read Aesop's fables, the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, and Shakespeare, often reciting passages aloud with unusual intensity, sometimes to the bemusement or irritation of those around him. He would memorize lines, then practice oratorical flourishes in front of startled cattle, amused siblings, or bemused friends. Once, he recited a long section from Hamlet at a courtroom break, leaving the judge nearly in tears. His law partner Herndon remembered Lincoln as saturated with Shakespeare, quoting not just the well-known lines but whole scenes. sometimes using them to make subtle legal points. Not all his stories were dignified. Lincoln loved jokes and wit, and sometimes deployed humor in surprisingly earthy ways. In court, he would tell tales so plain-spoken that fellow lawyers sometimes blushed. He used humor to disarm critics and soften the delivery of hard truths. He once diffused a hostile argument by telling the story of a young pig stuck between two fence posts, unable to move forward or back, a metaphor, he explained, for their legal dilemma. This capacity to see the comic in the grave, the light in the midst of darkness, suggests why he could withstand political storms that would have sunk others. It's little known that Lincoln was a physical marvel, his strength legendary among frontier folk. He could split logs with a single powerful stroke. In his 20s, he worked as a ferryman, wrestling heavy boats over the Sangamon River during floods so fierce that others refused the job. Locals recalled his hands as like bear paws, capable of throwing an axe or wrestling rivals in impromptu matches that sometimes drew crowds from miles around. He even ran for local office with the slogan, "If you don't vote for me, I'll beat you up," delivered, of course, with a wink. One story often retold among historians involves Lincoln's relationship to animals. He had an unusual compassion for creatures great and small. Once, he halted a stagecoach to rescue a piglet stuck in mud, vanity be damned. As he rolled up his sleeves and ruined his boots for the sake of the squealing beast. He adopted stray cats at the White House, letting them sleep in his lap during cabinet meetings. He grieved deeply when his beloved dog, Fido, was accidentally poisoned in Springfield. The intensity of his sorrow struck neighbors as both poignant and surprising. Lincoln's curiosity sometimes led to odd experiments and inventions. He remains the only president to hold a patent granted for a device that lifted riverboats over shoals. The prototype, made of wood, never left his law office, but the idea revealed a lifelong tinkerer's spirit. During the Civil War, he visited the patent office in Washington to examine new weapons and gadgets. He tested rifles on the White House lawn to the consternation of security. He followed reports of balloon reconnaissance, telegraph innovations, and prototypes for ironclad ships, not just as commander-in-chief, but as an enthusiast for technology. He insisted on touring the Washington Navy Yard to inspect new artillery and once attended a demonstration of a new torpedo, nearly suffering injury when the device exploded prematurely. Lincoln's dreams and premonitions have stirred fascination for generations. He was deeply interested in the mysterious and unexplained. The night before his assassination, Lincoln reportedly had a haunting dream. He described to friends and his wife a vision in which he walked into the East Room of the White House, saw a covered corpse attended by mourners, and asked, "Who is dead?" In the dream, someone replied, "The President." Though historians debate the tale's authenticity, the account spread quickly after his death, fueling speculation that Lincoln foresaw his own fate. He confided to his cabinet and to Mary Todd Lincoln other dreams of battles and dark portents. His wife herself was known for spiritualism. She held in the White House trying to contact their deceased sons. Lincoln attended several, seemingly open but skeptical, always a man searching for meaning in both the tangible and the mysterious. Lincoln's relationship with his father, Thomas Lincoln, was complicated and tense. Some believe the elder Lincoln's lack of appreciation for his son's intellect and ambition shaped Abraham's drive for self-improvement. When Thomas died, Abraham did not attend the funeral. In his letters, there is pain but little affection. Yet, he was tender with his stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, who encouraged his learning and emotional expression. The law office that Lincoln shared with Herndon provided material for endless anecdotes. Lincoln was known to spend hours lying on his back, legs resting atop a chair, lost in thought or reading. Sometimes, in court, Lincoln would appear intensely focused, only to surprise the room with an unexpected question that overturned all debate. His approach to law combined exhaustive preparation with a remarkable instinct for the heart of the matter. Herndon recounted that Lincoln could smell out the truth in a case, unmasking deception with simple logic or devastating humor. Lincoln's political losses were many, a detail often lost in triumphal retellings. Before his presidency, he failed in runs for the Illinois legislature, lost a bid for Congress after one term, and endured defeat in the crucial race against Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate in 1858. Each failure deepened his resolve. When asked by a reporter how he managed disappointment, Lincoln replied, "I have learned to adjust myself to the stone cast in my path. From it, perhaps, I build a bridge." He was an avid letter writer, especially to soldiers and their families. Lincoln's correspondence contains hundreds of deeply empathetic responses to parents who lost sons in battle. He expressed sorrow without empty platitudes, offering comfort in words that, while formal, seem heartfelt. In one famous letter to a widow named Lydia Bixby, Lincoln wrote, "I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement, and leave only the cherished memory of the loved and lost by our grateful nation." Even his relationship to religion was complex and little understood. Lincoln was never formally a church member. He attended services but did not join any congregation. Yet his later speeches, especially the second inaugural, are saturated with biblical language and references to divine justice. In private conversations, he sometimes expressed doubts and philosophical musings about fate and providence. He rejected sectarian strife, but believed profoundly in a moral order, one in which nations and individuals alike bore responsibility for their actions. Lincoln's friendships crossed boundaries of class, culture, and ideology. He maintained warm ties with men and women of all backgrounds, free black citizens who corresponded with him, impoverished neighbors, business rivals, and political adversaries. When Frederick Douglass visited Lincoln in the White House, Douglass was amazed by the president's openness and candor. "He treated me just as you would have expected him to treat any visitor," Douglass recalled, remarkable for the era. In public and private, Lincoln wrestled with melancholy, a gentler word for what today would be considered depression. After the death of his young son, Willie, Lincoln wandered the White House at night, plagued by grief. He believed agony could refine character. Friends noted that his sorrow made him both kinder and more reflective, able in moments of quiet, suffering to connect with the grief of millions. Near the end of his life, Lincoln's thinking about justice grew ever more expansive. He quietly supported limited voting rights for Black Americans, a stance far ahead of its time. Following his assassination, stories emerged of his wish to travel abroad after his second term. to visit the Holy Land. Whether true or not, the tales invite wonder at a restless, never-satisfied spirit. Stranger stories persist. It's said that Lincoln sometimes walked Washington at night, alone, slipping past guards to visit wounded soldiers or to gaze on the Capitol dome under construction. Guards found him wandering in deep thought. During the war, he would visit telegraph offices at all hours, waiting for news from the front. Lincoln was among the first presidents to be obsessed with instantaneous communication, a trait that today seems almost prophetic. There is the haunting anecdote of Lincoln reading poetry to guests as bullets flew at Fort Stevens within sight of the city, his hand steady, his voice calm. He understood that beauty and grief could coexist. That poetry and principle were not separate, but united in human resilience. And then there are the truly mysterious moments. Reports of Lincoln hearing the ticking of a clock in his Springfield home at midnight, stopping abruptly the moment he left for Washington, never to tick again. The recurring stories of his ghost in the White House, seen or felt by later presidents, first ladies, and even foreign leaders. As if the spirit of Lincoln refuses to leave the place where he served with such devotion. From odd dreams and uncanny escapes, to wild humor and quiet acts of compassion, the unknown stories of Lincoln are as endless as the questions they raise. They invite new generations to look beyond the public speeches and grand statues, into the wild heart, the pondering mind, the gentle hands of the rail splitter who became the nation's moral compass. The story of Abraham Lincoln does not end at Ford's Theater, nor in Springfield, nor even in the soaring marble and granite of the Lincoln Memorial. In truth, Lincoln's story exists wherever human beings face division, yet still hope for unity, where suffering demands compassion, and where moral courage must rise above fear. His journey from frontier obscurity to moral leadership in the most perilous moment of his nation's history continues to offer a mirror to the present, showing both who we are and who we might become. Lincoln's appeal endures partly because it is the story of an ordinary life, turned extraordinary through patient self-cultivation. His was not an effortless rise, far from it. He was not born into privilege or surrounded by influential mentors. He faced poverty, backbreaking labor, family losses, minimal formal schooling, and repeated political defeats. For many, his life serves as proof that greatness is not about the accident of birth, but about the daily choice to learn, to improve, and to act with integrity even in small things. He is, perhaps more than any historical figure, a democratic hero, one of us who nevertheless rose to meet the highest demands of leadership. Why does his life evoke such enduring inspiration? One reason lies in his deep humanity. Lincoln could make mistakes, wrestle with doubts, feel pain, yet still persevere and grow. His humor, humility, and capacity to admit error stand as a reminder that perfection is not the measure of a leader. Growth and resilience are. In an age when public figures often project certainty and infallibility, Lincoln's willingness to reveal his evolving thoughts is a radical kind of honesty. Then there is his moral arc. Lincoln did not begin life as an abolitionist. His early political career was cautious on slavery, shaped by political calculation and the prejudices of his time. And yet, step by careful step, he moved toward a bold and transformative embrace of emancipation. It is in that evolution that many find hope, that one can, even late in life, expand one's circle of moral concern, and act decisively for justice. He modeled the idea that to grow in wisdom and compassion is itself a form of leadership. Lincoln's greatness also came from balancing vision with pragmatism. In the Civil War, when the survival of the Republic was in doubt, he never lost sight of the end goal, the preservation of the Union, but he was flexible in means. He tried diplomacy with wayward states. When that failed, he fought. He reassured border states with moderate language. When the moment came, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation and redefined the war. This balance reminds us that principle and practicality need not be enemies, that one can stand firm in values while adapting tactics to reality. Another enduring lesson is Lincoln's radical empathy. He listened, truly listened, to those who disagreed with him. He sought to understand the South's grievances even as he fought its cause. He empathized with soldiers terrified at the front, with widows mourning their dead, with enslaved people longing for liberty. This empathy did not lead him to abandon justice. Rather, it gave his justice a human dimension. He could oppose fiercely, yet without hatred that would poison peace. For modern society, fractured by mistrust and contention, Lincoln's call in his second inaugural, with malice toward none, with charity for all, is as urgent as it was in 1865. It is a call not to soften our moral resolve, but to temper it with mercy. He understood that the health of a democracy rests not only on laws and victories, but on the spirit in which we treat one another after the battle is done. His leadership also challenges us to engage with the slow, often frustrating pace of change. Many forget how long Lincoln worked toward the major achievements of his presidency: years of political organizing, legal reasoning, coalition building, and public persuasion before action became possible. His life shows that transformational change is rarely instantaneous. It demands endurance, the patience to work through imperfect conditions, and the courage to take the next step even when the end goal seems far away. But Lincoln's story is not simply a reassurance. It is also a challenge. It forces us to ask, in our own lives, are we willing to confront injustice with persistent effort? Are we willing to risk unpopularity for what is right, as Lincoln did? Can we keep faith in one another and in the shared project of democracy when the times grow dark? For citizens of any nation, Lincoln's journey suggests that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be renewed and defended by leaders and ordinary people alike. The government of the people, by the people. For the people he spoke of at Gettysburg is not a permanent possession. It is a living trust, handed down from each generation to the next, fragile enough to be lost if neglected. His life is a warning that the very survival of democratic ideals often depends on whether a small number of individuals answer the call to moral responsibility. What also stands out is Lincoln's belief in words as instruments of change. His speeches shaped public sentiment and reframed the moral terms of the Civil War, the Gettysburg Address. In barely 3 minutes, transformed a bloody battlefield into a testament for democratic renewal. His farewell address to Springfield, his letters to grieving families, his remarks to soldiers. These blend moral vision with a simplicity that makes them timeless. In reading them, we see how language, wielded with honesty and moral conviction, can heal, inspire, and mobilize. Internationally, Lincoln stands as proof that leadership rooted in humility can command the world's respect. He did not seek war, nor glory, nor personal enrichment. Instead, he accepted a nearly impossible duty with an attitude of service. His personal modesty, the refusal to exploit office for vanity, is a trait that resonates even in other systems of government, from parliamentary democracies to liberation movements. Leaders from Mahatma Gandhi to Nelson Mandela reflected Lincoln's blend of moral clarity and willingness to reconcile former enemies. In reflecting on Lincoln today, we see lessons for business leaders, educators, activists, and every person navigating conflict and uncertainty. That listening is not weakness, but strength. That changing your mind when conscience demands is a mark of integrity, not inconsistency. That humor and humanity can sustain you and those you lead through the weight of great trials. That reconciliation after conflict is as urgent as victory during it. And that greatness is measured less by personal advancement than by how one uplifts the common good. Perhaps the deepest reason Lincoln's life continues to inspire is its refusal to let despair have the final word. His entire trajectory, from a boy reading by firelight in a one-room cabin, to a president guiding his nation through civil war, is a testament to hope's quiet power. This is not the hope of wishful thinking, but of deliberate action, the faith that by learning, by engaging, by standing for what is just, one can make life better for others. Standing in the shadow of Lincoln's memorial today, one can read the engraved lines of his addresses and feel that they are not relics of a distant time, but living challenges. They speak to inequality, division, war, and the longing for a shared national purpose. The stone may be cold, but the words burn. When we strip away the layers of myth, Lincoln emerges not smaller, but more instructive. He was not born to save a nation, nor was he singular in his moral impulses. He was, instead, a citizen who answered the needs of his time with every resource he had: his mind, his patience, his ability to persuade, his empathy, his readiness to grow. And when history placed the full burden of the Republic upon him, he bore it steadfastly until his life was taken. In that sense, Lincoln's story belongs to no single era, party, or nation. It belongs to all who believe that leadership is an act of service, that moral courage matters, and that unity forged through justice is worth sacrifice. It whispers down through the years that the work is never finished, that the more perfect union is an obligation we inherit and must pass forward. When we ask why Lincoln endures, perhaps the answer is simple: because every generation faces its own civil war of ideas, its own choice between cynicism and duty, its own moment to decide whether liberty, justice, and compassion will be defended or abandoned. And in those moments, the figure of Abraham Lincoln, tall, spare, earnest, patient, resolute, still walks beside us, reminding us what is possible.